from John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, I'm sure you remember Johnny Carson. He was the king of late night for about 30 years. And Johnny Carson had this gift. He could make everyone feel just so at ease sitting there in front of a television camera. I never thought he was particularly funny, but he did do a good interview. One night he had an 8-year-old on. An 8-year-old from West Virginia. That 8-year-old had rescued 2 of his friends from an abandoned mine. When Johnny heard about it, he knew he wanted to interview this little boy. So he flew him all the way from West Virginia to Los Angeles. As the interview progressed, here this 8-year-old boy sits beside Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson realized that this 8-year-old boy went to church every Sunday. So he asked him, "What did you learn in Sunday school last Sunday?" The little boy said, "Well, last Sunday we talked about Jesus going to a wedding and turning the water into wine." And Johnny Carson said, "And what did that story teach you?" Well, you could tell the little fella hadn't thought about that. He hadn't thought about how that story could impact his life. So he kind of put his head down and he thought a little bit. Finally, he lifted his head up, looked straight into Johnny Carson's eyes, and he said, "Well, Mr. Carson, what that story teaches me is if you're going to have a wedding, make sure you invite Jesus." That's some pretty good advice. I know there was a couple in Cana of Galilee that sure was glad Jesus was invited to their wedding. We don't know their names, but John tells us there was a wedding in Cana. Now, Cana was about 9 miles from Nazareth. Jesus lived in Nazareth. Mary, his mother, lived in Nazareth. So 9 miles wasn't that big of a trip for them to take. At this point, Jesus probably has 4 disciples. So at this point, right after Jesus begins his ministry, his mother, him, and 4 of his disciples go to this wedding in Cana. Mary seems to have some type of authority at this wedding. So a lot of scholars believe, we have no clue, but a lot of scholars do believe that it must have been a relative of Mary for her to get involved, for her to be listened to. Many scholars believe that it must have been one of her relatives. And you know the story. They're there, and the wedding is going fine. Everything is beautiful. Everything is going well. And there are two things you need to know. When it comes to the Jewish mind, two things are very important. First of all, weddings are important, and hospitality is very important. So weddings would last days or weeks. And you've got to understand, in this time when Jesus is living, the mode of transportation was very slow. You walked or you rode an animal. That's basically your two choices. The common people basically walked. So if you've got relatives coming from anywhere in the region, it's going to take them a while to get there. So the wedding celebration would continue on for a while. And all the neighboring villages, whenever there was a wedding going on, most of them would send some representatives to that wedding. You know why? In this day and age, inns were very scarce. Money was very tight. So if you had to travel anywhere in that region, it really helped if you knew somebody in the town you were going to. You could stay with them. If you'll remember back to my sermon, I know you don't, but I'm going to take it on faith, and I don't want to know that you don't. If you remember back to my Christmas communion sermon, I went and spoke about how Bethlehem probably didn't even have an inn. And Jesus, when he was born, probably was born in a relative's house. That's how they did things. So there were a couple of things you did not want to do. And running out of food and drink was one of them. Somewhere, probably the third day, they run out of wine. How does Mary know? We have no clue. But Mary goes up to Jesus, and Jesus says to Jesus, they have no more wine. Now, when I read the text, Jesus' response to her may have caught you a little bit off guard. I don't know about you, but I would not have said to my mother, woman. I may have said that once. I wouldn't have said it twice. And those of you who are mothers, which is just about all of you that are here, if you're a woman, you probably would not. I can see Diane's daughter coming up to her and saying, woman. It wouldn't have happened but once, would it? But you've got to understand, we've got about 3 languages going on here. Jesus probably spoke in Aramaic or Hebrew. It was written in Greek and translated to English. So when you've got all of those languages in the midst, it's kind of hard to get exactly what Jesus was saying. Incidentally, in John's gospel, Mary is never called by name. She's mentioned several times in John's gospel, but each time she's referred to as the mother of Jesus. Every time. Jesus addresses Mary twice in the Gospel of John. Both times he calls her woman. John chapter 2, when the water is turned into wine, he does. Anybody remember the second time? At the crucifixion, you're exactly right. John is the only writer to record it, but while Jesus is hanging on the cross, he looks down at his mother and he says, "Woman, behold your son." There are at least 5 times in the Gospel of John where Jesus is talking to a female and he calls her woman. I won't go through all of them, but this one might jar your memory. Remember the lady who was caught in the act of adultery? And they bring her to Jesus and they want to stone her. And Jesus says, well, the one that has no sin, let them first throw the stone. And they all leave and it's just Jesus and the woman. And he looks up to her. Remember what he asks her? "Woman, where are your accusers?" It's kind of unfortunate that it's translated woman. A better translation might be dear lady, because it really is a term of endearment. It's not rude at all. It's a term of affection. If I were to be translating or paraphrasing it, I would probably assume Jesus in our vernacular would have said, "Mother dear, if they're out of wine, that's not my business. That's not your business." Well, what is going on here? Mary comes to Jesus, and Mary wants Jesus to do something about this situation. And if you'll notice in the text, Jesus seems very hesitant. He's just started his ministry. He's in the process of calling his disciples. He only has 4 at this point, most scholars say. The last thing he needs and the last thing he wants is a bunch of attention right then. Did you notice what Mary does, though? Totally ignores what Jesus has said and goes to the chief steward and says, "Do whatever he tells you to do." Incidentally, that is the last time Mary ever speaks in the Bible. The last recorded words of Mary. She shows up elsewhere, but the last recorded words of Mary are, "Do whatever he tells you to do." Talking about Jesus. Fred Bevel taught me that. I won't forget it. Well, why does Jesus do anything to start with? He doesn't want the publicity. He doesn't want word to get out that he is a miracle maker. Incidentally, John never uses the word miracle either. There are lots of miracles in the Gospel of John, but John never uses the word miracle. John calls them signs. I'll tell you why I think Jesus stepped in. I think as Jesus thought about it, Jesus' heart was moved with compassion. All throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus will see someone in a bad place, a bad situation. And the Bible will say, and he was moved with compassion. Jesus, I think, knew this couple. He wouldn't have been at the wedding probably if he hadn't have. And he did not want them to suffer an embarrassment. He did not want them to get their marriage off on the wrong foot. I think it took him a moment, and I think he had to think about it, because I do not think Jesus had planned to do anything at this wedding. I think Jesus was still planning his first event, and this wasn't it, I don't think. So somehow he comes up with this idea. This must have been a very religious family, because you had 6 water jars over on the side. The Jews had this rigorous hand-washing ceremony. It took all kinds of water, so you had a special pot for it. And those jars were right over there. Jesus says to the servants, fill them all the way to the brim. Now, we're talking somewhere about 180 gallons. fill them to the brim with water, take some out, and bring it to the chief steward. Somewhere in between the time when they took the water out of the jar and got it to the chief steward, the water becomes wine. And the chief steward is amazed. I'm paraphrasing again, but he says, that is the best stuff I have ever put in my mouth. Most of the time they put the good stuff out first, but you have kept the good wine until now. And his disciples believed him. His disciples knew he was the Christ because of that sign. Now, there are a lot of lessons we can get from this passage. But the thing that really piques my attention, I guess since we've just finished Christmas, we've just gotten over Epiphany. Last Sunday was the baptism of the Lord Sunday, and we talked about Jesus' baptism. For me, this time when I read the story at least, the most intriguing thing is the placement of it in John's Gospel. Matthew and Luke introduce Jesus by talking about his lineage and his birth. John skips all that. John does not mention that at all. Instead, John brings up this particular story from Jesus' past and uses it to introduce Jesus. Now, at the end of John's gospel, John will make this statement. He'll say, if everything Jesus did was recorded, all the books in the world wouldn't be able to contain it. So we know John was picky about what he included in his gospel. And when you read the Gospel of John, John is not so much interested in recording history or writing history as he is writing theology. Everything John writes, John has a theological purpose for. So what is his purpose in telling us this story? Well, for starters, John was telling us that Jesus was a man of the people. Some of the most beautiful poetry in the Gospel of John was, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. John 1:14. And Jesus' appearance at this wedding in Cana quickly reinforced that bold declaration. Jesus' first miracle was not performed in the temple. It was not performed in Jerusalem. It was not performed in front of the scribes or the Pharisees. Instead, it was discreetly done among common people in a sleepy Palestinian village many miles away from the center of religious activity. It was in this rural environment that Jesus was at home. Jesus was engaged, and Jesus was involved in the everyday life and affairs of his neighbors. Jesus knew their names. He knew their struggles. He knew their dreams. He knew what they worried about. He knew what kept them up at night. He knew how important weddings were, and how guilty and embarrassed they would feel if they ran out of food and wine to serve their guests. So as a result, Jesus changes his mind about getting involved in this crisis, and he responds, and he uses his imagination to perform a wonderful miracle. Jesus turns 180 gallons of guilt and shame into 180 gallons of grace and mercy. Yes, that's how much water the servants probably put in those jars. One jar would have done it. 2 jars would have really done it. 6 jars. What did the psalmist say? My cup overflows. The psalmist penned that generations before this, but Jesus must have thought of those words. And this couple, who had a responsibility to feed the wedding guests, now must have felt the same way. You see, Jesus was sent by God to make hope visible. Jesus' mission was to turn despair into hope, to turn the struggling into soaring. Jesus wanted to reach out to those who were barely getting by and change their circumstances. You've heard me say this before. I know you've heard me say it when we've dealt with this passage before, and I probably said it when I've been in other passages. This passage teaches us, if it matters to you, it matters to Jesus. If it concerns you, it concerns Jesus. So many times we think God is too busy to be concerned with my little problems. And we only take the big things to God. Can you imagine what would have happened if these folks had thought, God is too busy to worry about our little inconvenience here of running out of wine? They would have missed out on a miracle. How many miracles do we miss out on because we think God is too busy to bother with our small stuff? If it matters to you, it matters to God. And you know, this would not be the last time that this beautiful, excited, and happy couple would run out of something. In the future, they'd run out of all kinds of things: food, money, energy, stamina, willpower, patience, dreams, hope, time. And when they did, God could be counted on to use Jesus and others to lead them, to guide them, to strengthen them, and to sustain them. And this particular passage, this wedding in Cana of Galilee, was chosen to be the lead story in the Gospel of John to inspire us to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Because we serve God best by engaging with those around us, just like Jesus did. We may not be able to do everything Jesus did, but we can and we must be the presence of Christ among our family members, among our neighbors, and we must follow Jesus' examples. Because let me tell you, there is no shortage of people all around us who have come up short and dug through empty pockets to find hope. Everyone runs out of something fairly often. In these times, we need to be one of the many who reach out to them, who turn grief into joy, who turn fear into courage, rejection into acceptance, worry into peace of mind, and despair into hope. I've come to the conclusion that there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who turn water into wine through compassion and generosity. And there are those who turn wine into water through a critical and judgmental spirit. Which type of a person are you? Which type of a person are you? Incidentally, John chose this story to introduce us to Jesus. If someone were writing about your life, what kind of a story could they tell to introduce you? Would it be a story of grace and mercy? Or would it be a story of judgment and pettiness? Don't despair. Your story's not over. And you hold the pen. If you don't have a good story yet, why not this week determine to live in such a way that you will write the perfect story for someone to introduce you as a servant of God, as someone who makes a difference in the world. You've got the pen in your hand. Go forth from this place. Live in such a way that people will say, when I think of that person, I think of Jesus. Amen.